All right, so Veda Peters from the Lung Association. I'm here with Dr. Amy Curtwright, who works with the RAND Corporation from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to our air quality workshop here in Vancouver, BC. We're sorry that you can't be with us. So the questions that I have for you, what air emission sources are associated with shale gas production and processing?
So shale gas extraction combines two different technologies, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. And there's a long involved process associated with this. It involves a lot of equipment, a lot of water, a lot of truck activity, some chemicals. And so the emissions actually span the full life cycle of the natural gas extraction and processing life cycle. And if you see on the chart 2, I show a picture of this. So we've got emissions from trucks that are bringing in sand and chemicals and equipment, all the way out to venting of methane from the dehydrators that are used to remove the trace amounts of water from the natural gas at these compressor stations. So we're talking about multiple diesel sources, venting, flaring, leaks and spills. The compressor stations, it's largely emissions related to the natural gas combustion that powers the equipment there.
So then what would be the key air pollutants produced?
So there are a lot of different air pollutants. We took a look in our study at 5 that are regulated by the U.S. Clean Air Act. VOCs, so volatile organics, those come from multiple sources, and I have this listed on the next chart. There's NOx, which is mostly from the combustion of natural gas at those compressor stations, but there's also some of that from diesel. There are SO2 emissions. That's primarily a diesel problem. And there's particulate matter from the diesel, from the road dust, from secondary formation from a reaction with SO2, and then there's also ozone. And so the damages that you're going to see are mostly related to health issues. That's the largest portion of the cost of those damages, but it also includes things like damages to infrastructure and agriculture and aesthetic problems as well.
And what would be the health risks?
Well, so, I mean, there are a whole lot of different health risks. I mean, the highest cost health risk is premature death. that has the highest value. But, you know, things like increased incidence of asthma, visits to the hospital are increased in regions that have this kind of air quality problems.
So the potential magnitude of the damage from these emissions would be?
So we took a look at, our case study was in the state of Pennsylvania, where there's a lot of activity in the last couple of years. We looked at, we focused on 2011, which was actually a very high level of activity. And we found that the ongoing production and processing emissions were going to be the ones that were most significant. And I show that on chart 4. The production and the processing emissions are going to be the highest. But statewide, we estimated that emissions damages were associated with about $7 to $32 million worth of damages across the state.
That's substantial. So how does the size and location of the damage compare to other sources?
Well, so it is substantial. It's not insignificant. But in the next chart, I show how those emissions compare to other sources in the state. So you can see the shale gas extraction industry on the first row and the levels of emissions associated with each of those pollutants. And so statewide, the emissions of VOCs and NOx are basically on par with some of our largest coal power plants. And in one county where a lot of this activity is happening, we're talking about emissions that are 20 to 40 times what's needed to trigger a major source threshold, but they're minor sources. The largest damage actually happens not in the county where the most emissions were, but in the county that was closest to a large population. So not only is it the number of, the total tons of emissions, but it's also who lives near those emission sources and what the ambient air quality, the background air quality is like. So in that county alone, it was $1.2 to $8.3 million was our estimate.
So significant. And are there approaches that can be used to minimize the air quality impacts related to fossil fuel processing?
There are. One thing that's worth pointing out is that There are lots of risks associated with shale gas extraction. Some of them are kind of uncertain. A lot of talk has been, a lot of attention has been given to water damages, but the emissions damages are actually guaranteed under the current order of doing business. And so it's important to consider this in the regulatory framework. So one thing I alluded to earlier was a minor versus major source, and it's possible that these emissions should be considered in some sort of aggregated form, but we have to be careful to not create incentives for companies to come up with loopholes to get around this. So it might actually increase the complexity of the regulation without actually improving the air quality. So that's something you want to try to avoid. And then the easiest thing to do really from a regulatory perspective is to require best available technologies. And they've actually increased the requirements in the state of Pennsylvania since we published this work. So the requirements for the emissions levels can be lowered to set to a level that's acceptable to society.
Well, that's good. Those are all the questions I have for you. You can get on with your day and be prepared to do this again for the real thing for the video. For
right.
the group in a few minutes. All right. Thanks
all
a
right.
lot.
Thank you.
You're welcome.